In the spring of 1940, when the thunder of German panzers tore through the Ardennes, French soldiers who had once marched with confidence in their own armor found themselves staring into the abyss of defeat. The nation that had pioneered the tank in the Great War now discovered that its machines were sluggish, fragmented, and utterly unprepared for the lightning war that descended upon them. Memories of that collapse clung to every survivor like an invisible weight, and by 1944, when whispers of liberation spread through occupied towns and villages, the wounds of those days had not yet healed. French officers recalled with bitterness how their once vaunted Char B-1 heavy tanks, formidable in armor and firepower, had been squandered through poor coordination, left isolated without fuel, or picked apart by Luftwaffe dive bombers. What had once seemed like steel fortresses became slow-moving coffins, monuments to doctrine that had failed them. For the French infantrymen of 1944, the word tank evoked both awe and dread. He remembered the chaos of 1940, the roar of German panzers outpacing his unit, the clatter of tracks on cobbled roads as villages fell one after another, and the sight of comrades fleeing before the onslaught. Soldiers who survived captivity or melted into the resistance carried the scar of knowing that France's armored forces had been humiliated. To them, armor meant something cumbersome, a liability rather than a weapon of liberation. They whispered among themselves that nothing could match the speed of the German machines that had broken their country in 6 short weeks. Life under occupation hardened those impressions. For 4 long years, France endured humiliation and hunger, its soldiers either languishing in prisoner-of-war camps or hiding in the shadows as partisans. When they gathered in secret cellars or barns, resistance fighters often speculated about the promised Allied invasion. Some imagined British tanks like the Matilda or Churchill lumbering steel beasts designed to grind through defenses. Others recalled faint rumors of American armor, though few had seen one. To most French fighters, tanks remained abstract dreams, symbols of a powerful ally they hoped would appear, but without any clear picture of what they would look like. The truth, however, was that the Americans were preparing to unleash something that would defy every expectation. The United States Army, having studied the lessons of 1940, built not for static defense, but for movement, coordination, and speed. The Sherman tank, though not the heaviest, represented an entirely different philosophy of war: reliability, mobility, and sheer numbers. French soldiers in exile, training with the Free French forces in North Africa and Britain, whispered tales of these machines. They were told the Shermans could march hundreds of kilometers without breaking down, that they could be repaired in hours, not days, and that columns of them rolled like rivers of steel, never ending, never pausing. Still, for men who remembered the lumbering French tanks of 1940, it sounded too good to be true. When the summer of 1944 arrived and Operation Overlord brought Allied armies across the Channel, French fighters waiting in Normandy braced themselves for the sound of liberation. Many expected artillery, bombers, and waves of infantry. Few were prepared for the first great rumble of American tank columns arriving inland. In their minds, tanks were slow-moving machines vulnerable to ambush. But what they were about to see would shake those assumptions to the core. The defeat of 1940 had left them with a deep sense of skepticism. To some, the idea that armor could ever outmatch German panzers seemed like fantasy. They recalled the terror of hearing tank treads approach in the night, the helplessness of having no speed to escape, and the futility of watching French machines break down mid-march. To imagine that their liberators could bring something faster, stronger, and more enduring seemed almost like a cruel joke. And yet, as they stood on the cusp of 1944, ready to rise in arms and greet the Allies, They would soon discover that the Americans had built a weapon that was not only fast, but relentless, a weapon that would change forever their conception of armored war. The French soldier of 1944 was a man carrying ghosts. He was hardened by occupation, yet haunted by memories of sudden collapse. He had lived through hunger, fear, and humiliation, clinging to rumors of Allied strength. When he finally came face to face with American tanks, he would not simply see machines. He would see the embodiment of a new doctrine, a promise that history might not repeat itself. But to appreciate that moment, one had to first understand the depth of their disbelief, the shadow cast by the disaster of 1940. Without it, the shock of witnessing America's fast tanks in 1944 could never be fully measured. By 1941, the French nation had been split in two: the occupied North under the iron heel of German control, and the collaborationist Vichy regime in the South. For the ordinary French soldier who had escaped capture or returned home in humiliation, life was defined by silence and waiting. The once proud regiments that had paraded along the Champs-Élysées now existed only in memory, while German patrols marched in their place. In cafes and dimly lit barns, men who had once worn uniforms now carried whispered conversations about sabotage and resistance. Their weapons were often old hunting rifles or pistols passed secretly from one hand to another. The idea of standing against German armor with such tools seemed absurd. Tanks had become for them not weapons of liberation, but symbols of overwhelming power wielded by the occupier. What little armor the resistance did possess was pitifully outdated. A few French tanks had been hidden away in barns or camouflaged in fields during the surrender, but fuel shortages and the constant risk of discovery by German patrols made them little more than rusting relics. The Char B-1S, once thought invincible, were now trophies displayed by the Germans or reused under new insignia. For French fighters, the sight of a tank did not inspire courage. It reminded them of their nation's broken defenses. They lived under a constant reminder that in 1940 mobility and speed had crushed them. That bitter truth shaped their imagination. The enemy had fast, decisive weapons. The French had none. The resistance, however, grew bolder as time passed. By 1943, sabotage of rail lines and attacks on German convoys became more coordinated. Yet, even as these men risked their lives, they could not forget that they were fighting an enemy whose armored columns still seemed untouchable. They dreamed of help from abroad, and every whisper of an Allied landing sent a ripple of hope through their ranks. When American leaflets were dropped from aircraft promising liberation, French fighters clutched them as if they were sacred texts. Still, the memory of past defeat made them cautious. Would the Allies arrive with machines capable of matching the German panzer divisions that had humiliated France? Or would history repeat itself? Meanwhile, far from occupied France, in the deserts of North Africa, French soldiers who had joined the Free French forces began to see glimpses of American power. After Operation Torch, in late 1942, French units were re-equipped with American weapons and trained alongside U.S. forces. For many of these men, it was the first time they saw the Sherman tank. Its broad tracks and rounded turret seemed unassuming at first glance, almost less imposing than the massive German Tigers they had heard of. Yet when they watched Shermans moving across the desert with a speed and endurance their old machines had never possessed, something inside them shifted. These tanks did not stall after a few kilometers. They did not choke on dust or overheat in the sun. They simply rolled forward, tirelessly, like mechanical beasts bred for movement. The French officers who had doubted began to speak quietly among themselves. Perhaps these Americans had indeed learned how to fight the Germans on their own terms. For the majority of French fighters back home, however, these revelations remained unknown. They waited in villages, on farms, and in city cellars, planning acts of sabotage with the resources at hand. They lived half-lives, farmers by day and partisans by night, always conscious of the sound of German boots on cobblestones. Tanks remained part of their nightmares rather than their hopes. In hushed voices, they admitted to one another that only overwhelming Allied armor could turn the tide. Still, skepticism ran deep. They had been promised salvation before, and in 1940 that salvation never arrived. The contrast between the lived experience of occupation and the unseen preparations across the Channel defined this period of waiting. French soldiers in hiding measured time not in months or years, but in rumors. The rumor of an Allied fleet, the rumor of American weapons, the rumor of tanks that could outpace the German panzers. And while they dreamed of such machines, they could not quite believe in them. They had lived too long under the shadow of defeat to imagine that salvation could arrive with such mechanical swiftness. Only when steel and thunder rolled across their homeland in 1944 would those doubts be shattered. But in these long years of waiting, disbelief was the only armor they possessed. When the Allies finally crossed the Channel in June 1944, the French countryside trembled with anticipation. For years, whispers had spread like smoke that an invasion was coming, that American soldiers with strange accents and endless supplies would arrive, that this time the Germans would not be able to stop the tide. For men who had lived through the bitter collapse of 1940 and the dark weight of occupation, these rumors felt almost unreal. Liberation was a word repeated so often that it seemed to lose its meaning, and yet, on the beaches of Normandy, it suddenly became a reality. French fighters and civilians alike strained to see what kind of power their allies would bring ashore. The first French soldiers to make contact with American forces were struck by contrasts that seemed almost surreal. The GIs themselves looked different from the British troops many had met in exile. Their uniforms were more practical, their equipment plentiful, their manner confident but not aristocratic. They spoke with easy informality, carrying cigarettes, chocolate, and chewing gum, luxuries unimaginable under occupation. To the weary French, who had learned to make do with scraps, this abundance was almost as shocking as the sheer numbers of men pouring across the beaches. Yet it was the machines, those hulking shapes that rumbled behind the infantry, that drew the most astonished stares. For many Frenchmen, the only tanks they remembered were the slow Char B-1S, or the antiquated Renaults that had failed them in 1940. The Germans, on the other hand, had filled their nightmares with images of panzers advancing faster than any defense could stop. And now, rolling through the hedgerows and muddy Norman fields, came something unexpected. American Sherman tanks, dozens of them, moving in formation with a confidence that felt alien. At first sight, some French fighters were unimpressed. The Shermans lacked the brutish silhouette of a tiger and seemed smaller than the monstrous machines of German propaganda. But as the columns passed, their speed and rhythm revealed something remarkable. These were not isolated giants crawling forward to be ambushed. They were part of a living, breathing system. The sound was unlike anything French ears had heard before. Engines hummed in synchronized rhythm, their tracks cutting across fields without hesitation. The Shermans did not crawl, they flowed. Resistance fighters, crouching at the edges of villages or standing cautiously at crossroads, found themselves struggling to process what they saw. Could tanks really move like this? Could they keep pace with trucks, infantry, and artillery in one seamless advance? To men accustomed to tanks stalling, breaking down, or falling behind, the sight was transformative. For the first time, armor seemed less like a burden and more like a force of liberation. In one small Norman town, villagers recalled how the American columns seemed endless. Trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition followed closely behind the tanks, ensuring they never slowed. French soldiers who had joined the resistance and now attached themselves to American units realized quickly that these machines were supported in ways their own had never been. Fuel dumps, mobile workshops, spare parts, everything was planned so that the tanks could keep rolling. It was this reliability, this logistical depth, that astonished them most. The memory of 1940 had taught them that a tank, no matter how powerful, was useless if it stood idle without fuel or repair. Yet here, in the summer of 1944, they saw machines that seemed immune to such failures. The Americans themselves treated their tanks not as sacred, irreplaceable treasures, but as tools. If one broke, another took its place. If a Sherman was destroyed, there were always more. French fighters noticed how casually American crews joked about their machines, calling them Ronsons or Tommy Cookers, with dark humor, even while maintaining confidence in their mobility. To French eyes, used to scarcity and loss, this abundance bordered on the unbelievable. It was as though the Americans had an endless reservoir of steel and fuel hidden just across the ocean. The psychological effect was immediate. French soldiers who had doubted their nation's future began to feel a cautious pride stirring. They saw that the tide was turning not just because of numbers, but because of speed. These American tanks did not pause, did not stumble, did not surrender momentum. They moved as if the very idea of retreat had been forgotten. And as they watched Sherman after Sherman roll past, French fighters began to believe that perhaps, at last, the nightmare of 1940 could be erased, not with words or promises, but with the relentless thunder of American tracks. For the French soldiers who had endured the long years of occupation, the first extended sight of Sherman tank columns advancing inland was an experience that bordered on the surreal. They were accustomed to thinking of tanks as rare, lumbering machines, symbols of a bygone defeat rather than a path to victory. Yet here in 1944, as American forces pushed through the bocage country of Normandy, French eyes witnessed something entirely different. Steel waves rolling forward in unbroken succession, their movement confident, almost casual, as though nothing could stop them. The Shermans did not travel alone. They came in long columns that stretched beyond the horizon, supported by trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and armored cars, a mechanized ecosystem that made French soldiers realize how far their own army had fallen behind by 1940. The sheer density of the movement was overwhelming. Men who had once seen isolated French tanks stranded on roadsides now stared in disbelief as the Americans brought armor in numbers that seemed impossible. It was not simply one or two tanks per village, but dozens upon dozens, each one ready to fight, each one backed by a logistics network that seemed limitless. At first, some French fighters doubted the machines themselves. The Shermans looked smaller than the terrifying tigers of German propaganda, their armor less imposing, their guns seemingly modest. But then they saw how the Shermans behaved in combat. Unlike the ponderous French Char B-1, which required coordination the army had never mastered, these tanks moved with fluidity, weaving through narrow Norman lanes, cresting hills at surprising speed, and turning with agility that belied their bulk. They did not halt to form grandiose lines. They simply pressed forward, always in motion. For French eyes, trained to expect hesitation and breakdown, it was an awakening. One resistance fighter later recalled how the ground shook for hours as Shermans rumbled past his village. He described the sound as both terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because it evoked memories of German armor sweeping through in 1940, exhilarating because this time the columns were friendly, bringing liberation instead of conquest. The French soldiers who marched beside them could scarcely believe the tempo. "They move like cavalry," one officer remarked, astonished at the pace of the American advance. It was as though the old traditions of mobility in war had been reborn in steel, and the French, who had once prided themselves on their light cavalry, felt a flicker of recognition and pride. The psychological contrast to 1940 could not have been sharper. Then, French tanks had been superior on paper in some respects, heavier armor, larger guns, but they were scattered, misused, and starved of support. In 1944, the Americans showed what massed armor truly meant. The Shermans were not meant to duel the German Tigers one-on-one. They were designed to swarm, to move, to overwhelm through sheer momentum. French soldiers observing this doctrine felt as if they were witnessing a different kind of war altogether. It was not about single machines proving their superiority, but about entire formations acting like a living organism. As the tanks moved through liberated towns, French civilians lined the streets, cheering and throwing flowers, but the soldiers among them studied the machines with a more critical eye. They noticed how quickly a Sherman could halt, pivot its turret, and resume its march. They marveled at how the crews worked seamlessly with accompanying infantry, radios crackling with coordination that France's 1940 army had never mastered. It was not just the tanks themselves, but the way they were used, fast, relentless, always pressing forward, that astonished the French. For those who joined the columns, riding atop the tanks or marching beside them, the feeling was one of disbelief, slowly giving way to exhilaration. Each kilometer advanced erased a little of the shame of 1940. Each German roadblock crushed under Sherman tracks reminded them that the age of helplessness was ending. French soldiers could scarcely reconcile the memory of broken, scattered armor with the reality of this mechanized tide. They whispered to one another that perhaps the Americans had discovered the secret the French had missed. That speed, not weight, was the true essence of armored warfare. By the time the Shermans reached deeper into the French countryside, the disbelief had hardened into conviction. French soldiers who had once doubted now spoke openly of the tank's prowess. They had seen with their own eyes that American armor was not merely functional, it was unstoppable in its tempo. For them, it was as if history had reversed itself. The same roads that had once borne German columns of conquest now thundered with Allied machines of liberation, faster and stronger than anything France had ever fielded. And in that realization, French soldiers found not only hope, but a new sense of purpose. The first impression had been visual, the endless lines of Shermans rolling past, stretching further than French eyes could measure. But the second, more haunting impression was auditory. The sound of the American armor was unlike anything they had known before. It was not the erratic roar of French machines from 1940, nor the menacing clatter of German panzers remembered in nightmares. The Shermans produced a steady, rhythmic growl, an industrial heartbeat that pulsed through the hedgerows of Normandy. French soldiers described it as the sound of inevitability, a mechanical thunder that signaled not just movement, but unstoppable advance. In 1940, when French soldiers had faced German armor, the noise of approaching panzers meant terror. It was the herald of encirclement, the prelude to collapse. They remembered the shrill wail of Stuka sirens above, the choking smoke of broken engines, and the chaos of retreating columns. That trauma was so deeply ingrained that even in 1944, some resistance fighters flinched instinctively when they first heard tanks approaching in the distance. Yet, as the American columns drew closer, the sound revealed a different truth. These were not predators hunting them down. These were allies, moving with precision and confidence, carrying liberation on their tracks. The speed of the Shermans became even clearer in combat. French fighters who joined American units were astonished at how swiftly the tanks could redeploy. In villages where German defenders set up ambushes, the Shermans did not lumber toward danger as French tanks once had. They swung wide, circled quickly, and struck from unexpected angles. Infantry advancing alongside marveled at how seamlessly the machines maneuvered through narrow streets, pivoting their turrets while their engines never stopped rumbling. It was not a stop-and-start battle, but a rolling tide, one that never surrendered momentum. For French observers, it was disorienting. They had grown used to armor being static, vulnerable, chained by logistics and terrain. But the Americans treated their tanks as if they were cavalry, charging forward, exploiting gaps, never lingering long enough to become targets. A French officer attached to an American armored division later admitted that he could scarcely believe how swiftly entire columns shifted positions. "They fight with motion," he said, "not with weight." The French doctrine of 1940 had prized heavy armor and deliberate engagements. The Americans had rewritten the rule book, proving that mobility was as deadly a weapon as firepower. The sound of the engines carried psychological weight as well. In town after town, civilians and resistance fighters reported how their spirits surged when they heard the Shermans before they saw them. The noise rolled across fields and through valleys like a promise. To men who had lived under occupation, the sound was liberation itself, an anthem of steel. French soldiers marching with the columns noticed how even German prisoners reacted with unease. To the Wehrmacht, trained to fear swarming attacks and relentless pressure, the American rumble meant that the battle was already slipping away. Yet the speed of the tanks was not only physical, it was strategic. The French could see that the Americans understood logistics in a way their own army never had. Supply trucks shadowed the columns, delivering fuel and ammunition with almost uncanny precision. Mechanics repaired damaged Shermans in hours rather than days, and fresh machines were always waiting to replace losses. French soldiers realized with awe that the Americans had built not just fast tanks, but an entire system designed to keep them fast forever. It was a revelation that went beyond machinery. It was a lesson in how wars were truly won. For French veterans of 1940, the contrast could not have been sharper. Then, tanks had stalled for lack of fuel, been abandoned for lack of spare parts, or sat helpless without air support. Now, in 1944, they witnessed armor moving as part of a synchronized orchestra, tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft, all harmonizing in tempo. The result was an advance that seemed unstoppable, a momentum that carried with it the weight of destiny. By the late summer, French soldiers were no longer merely astonished, they were inspired. The sound of Shermans in motion became the soundtrack of liberation, replacing the echoes of defeat with the rhythm of victory. For those who had once doubted, the disbelief slowly gave way to pride. They understood that they were marching alongside a force unlike any they had known before, one whose power lay not just in steel, but in the speed of its heart. And as they followed the rolling thunder of American tanks deeper into their homeland, they knew that the shadow of 1940 was finally beginning to lift. For many French soldiers, the true shock came not just from watching American tanks rumble past, but from the moment they were invited to climb aboard and fight alongside them. To sit atop a Sherman, feeling the vibrations of its engine surge through the steel frame, was unlike anything they had known in 1940. The French armor of that earlier war had been ponderous, claustrophobic, machines that demanded immense effort for limited gain. By contrast, the Shermans radiated a sense of vitality. They were not delicate fortresses waiting to break down. They were hardy, flexible war horses that seemed eager to devour the road ahead. French volunteers who joined American armored units in 1944 often carried lingering doubts. They remembered how quickly the German panzers had outmaneuvered them and worried that history might repeat itself. But the Americans had a confidence born not of arrogance. To the French, used to scarcity and tension, the Americans' relaxed manner felt surreal. It was as if fighting a war with endless tanks and fuel had transformed battle into something routine. The training sessions astonished them even more. French recruits were shown how to handle radios, how to coordinate movements with infantry, and how to rely on speed rather than brute force. For an army that in 1940 had been paralyzed by poor communication, the idea of real-time coordination was revolutionary. Within days, French soldiers who once dreaded tanks were learning to ride them with confidence, marveling at how responsive the Shermans felt compared to their own lumbering relics of the past. They discovered that these machines could pivot swiftly, accelerate on uneven ground, and sustain long marches without breaking down. It was as though they were being reintroduced to the very concept of armored warfare. One French lieutenant later recalled how, during his first mission with an American tank crew, he expected the vehicle to falter when crossing muddy terrain. Instead, the Sherman plowed forward without hesitation, its tracks gripping the earth with steady determination. He confessed that he had braced himself for failure, haunted by memories of abandoned French armor littering the roadsides in 1940. But when the Sherman crested the hill and kept moving, he felt an almost childlike wonder. "It was alive," he wrote, "as if it carried us on its shoulders, invincible and unstoppable." The Americans encouraged the French to trust the tempo of their machines. "Keep moving," one U.S. sergeant told them, "and you'll live. Stop moving, and you're a target." This philosophy resonated deeply with men who had suffered under doctrines of static defense. The French realized that their allies treated tanks as cavalry designed to flow across the battlefield in sweeping maneuvers. To fight alongside such speed was intoxicating. For the first time in years, French soldiers felt not like relics of a defeated army, but like riders of a new, unstoppable force. Even the smallest details impressed them. Spare parts were always available, fuel convoys seemed endless, ammunition was never in short supply. The Americans had built an entire ecosystem to support their armor, and French soldiers were stunned by the efficiency. They compared it bitterly to their own experience in 1940, when tanks ran dry or broke down with no support in sight. Now, when a Sherman was damaged, mechanics swarmed over it like surgeons, returning it to the fight within hours. To French eyes, this seemed like sorcery. The disbelief, however, was not purely technical. It was emotional. French soldiers who climbed onto the Shermans felt that they were climbing out of the shadows of 1940. Every kilometer traveled with the Americans was a symbolic journey away from defeat and toward redemption. They began to shed the weight of humiliation, replacing it with a fierce determination to reclaim their honor. Riding with the Shermans, they no longer felt like spectators of liberation. They felt like its authors. By the autumn of 1944, French units equipped with American tanks began taking part in offensives on their own, proving that the lessons had been absorbed. Yet even as they fought, many admitted privately that they still struggled to believe what they were experiencing. After years of despair, the sight of France advancing behind fast, unstoppable tanks felt almost too miraculous. But the sound of engines beneath them and the momentum of steel under their command silenced all doubts. The nightmare of helplessness was ending, and the French were riding into history atop the giants of America's armored power. By late summer of 1944, disbelief had transformed into something more visceral, fury. For French soldiers fighting alongside American armored divisions, the speed of the Shermans was no longer simply a curiosity or a marvel. It was a weapon, a living force that carried them into battles where momentum became the deciding factor. They had watched the columns stream across Normandy, seen villages liberated in hours rather than days, and now they were part of operations where American tanks moved so swiftly that German defenses crumbled before they had time to reorganize. For French fighters who had endured 4 years of humiliation, this was not just war. It was revenge delivered with steel and fire. One joint operation near Paris left an indelible mark on many French observers. German units had dug into defensive positions, confident that narrow streets and barricades would stall any Allied armor. In 1940, such obstacles had indeed spelled disaster for the French, whose tanks had bogged down in confusion and isolation. But the Shermans approached differently. They did not slow to form cumbersome lines. They surged forward in columns, pivoting around obstacles, smashing through weaker points, and circling defenders with astonishing speed. French infantry moving with them were stunned at how quickly the situation flipped. Within hours, strong points that might have resisted for days were bypassed and neutralized. The Germans, who once seemed invincible, now looked clumsy and reactive. For the French, the effect was electrifying. These were not just victories, they were acts of redemption. Every German retreat, every abandoned position, every broken line seemed to erase a fragment of the national shame from 1940. The speed of the Shermans was not merely tactical, it was psychological. It allowed the French to reclaim a sense of dominance they had thought lost forever. They were no longer the victims of a Blitzkrieg, they were riding one. The fury of liberation was perhaps most visible when French units finally entered Paris in August 1944. Though much of the fighting was carried out by resistance forces inside the city, the arrival of Free French tanks equipped with American armor provided the symbolic weight of victory. Civilians lined the boulevards, throwing flowers and crying tears of joy. But the soldiers atop those tanks felt something deeper, disbelief that they were here, in their capital, not as prisoners or fugitives, but as victors. Many recalled the Shermans that had carried them through hedgerows and villages, the rumble of engines that had become the rhythm of liberation. Without that speed, without that relentlessness, they knew Paris might have remained under occupation far longer. On other fronts, the fury turned into ruthless efficiency. French crews driving American tanks fought in Lorraine and Alsace, where they confronted German armor on more equal terms. They saw firsthand the danger of Tigers and Panthers, machines that could destroy a Sherman with a single shot. Yet the lesson had been learned. Speed was survival. French and American crews maneuvered their Shermans like packs of wolves, circling, flanking, never allowing the heavier German tanks to dominate the battlefield. What astonished the French was not just that this tactic worked, but that it was sustainable. There were always more Shermans, always more fuel, always more reinforcements. This was a kind of war France had never been able to wage, a war of abundance, where speed and numbers crushed fearsome but isolated giants. For men who had once cowered before German panzers, the transformation was profound. They no longer felt powerless when they heard engines in the distance. Instead, they felt anticipation, knowing that the thunder of Shermans meant attack rather than retreat. The disbelief lingered. It was hard to reconcile the broken memories of 1940 with the furious momentum of 1944. But it was now mingled with pride. French soldiers began to believe that their army, reborn in American steel, could reclaim its honor not only in France, but across Europe. The fury of 1944 was not blind rage. It was focused, disciplined, sharpened by years of suffering. Riding alongside Sherman's, French soldiers learned that speed could be vengeance, that mobility itself was a form of justice. Every village liberated, every road retaken, every German unit scattered was proof that France was rising again. And with each new victory, the French soldier who had once doubted could no longer deny the truth. America's fast tanks had not only changed the battlefield, they had changed France itself. As autumn of 1944 turned into winter, the French soldiers who had marched, fought, and ridden alongside the Americans began to understand that they were witnessing not just a campaign, but a revolution in warfare. The shock they had first felt when they saw endless columns of Shermans rolling across Normandy had matured into recognition. These machines, and the doctrine that animated them, represented a new philosophy of battle. No longer was armored warfare a contest of lumbering giants. It was a dance of mobility, logistics, and coordination. The French, who had once doubted, now found themselves disciples of this new creed. The lessons were everywhere. In Lorraine, French units fighting with American support watched as Shermans bypassed German strongpoints instead of hammering uselessly against them. The tanks moved swiftly across rivers with temporary bridges erected almost overnight, their pace relentless. French officers could hardly believe the tempo of such operations. Where their 1940 manuals had spoken of deliberate, methodical advances, the Americans demonstrated the power of fluidity, striking one day in one direction and the next day 50 kilometers away. For French soldiers, this was nothing short of revelation. Even when setbacks came, such as during the bitter fighting of the Ardennes in December, the French noticed the difference. The Germans still relied on sudden armored thrusts, hoping to replicate the shock of 1940. But the Americans absorbed the blows, regrouped, and unleashed their tanks in counterattacks with astonishing speed. French units who fought alongside them were stunned by the resilience of the system. Where the French army of 1940 had collapsed after the first hammer blow, the Allies now rebounded, proving that mobility and logistics could withstand even the fiercest German assaults. By early 1945, French soldiers were not merely observers of American tank warfare. They were practitioners. French armored divisions, re-equipped with Shermans, advanced through Alsace and into Germany itself. The disbelief of 1944, the sheer astonishment that tanks could move so fast, be so reliable, and come in such endless numbers, had transformed into something else: conviction. They believed in the system because they had seen it work, and they carried those lessons into their own doctrine. The French army, after the war, rebuilt its armored forces around the principles it had learned from the Americans: speed, coordination, and the importance of supply. The transformation went deeper than tactics. For the men who had survived 1940, fought in the resistance, and then joined the armored thrusts of liberation, the fast American tanks became symbols of redemption. Riding on Shermans into liberated towns, they felt the humiliation of defeat being burned away by the fire of momentum. They realized that armor could be not only the tool of their conquerors, but the instrument of their freedom. The disbelief that had once haunted them became pride, and that pride shaped the rebirth of the French army and nation. After the war, when French officers wrote their reports and soldiers told their stories, one theme returned again and again: speed. They marveled at how the Americans had taught them that a tank was not just a fortress on tracks, but a weapon of movement, an engine of tempo. Many admitted that they had never truly believed it until they had seen Shermans surge across their homeland, faster than fear, faster than doubt, faster even than memory itself. Thus, the legacy of 1944 was not only liberation, but transformation. The French soldier, once broken by the memory of Blitzkrieg, had learned a new kind of warfare from his allies. America's fast tanks had shown him that victory came not from standing still, but from never stopping, from keeping the thunder of engines rolling until the enemy collapsed. What had begun as disbelief in 1944 ended as doctrine for the future. And in that journey, from humiliation to astonishment to conviction, the French soldier found not only a new way of war, but a restored sense of dignity.